Mrs Cummins. I beg to move that this House considers whether the Equalities Act 2010 protects children from disadvantaged backgrounds. I raise this today, Mrs Cummins, because in truth, I'm not convinced that it does. And in fact, my view is that the misapplication and misinterpretation of the Equalities Act has led to the exclusion of some of our country's poorest people. Whether by flawed design or subsequent false interpretation, the Act doesn't deliver what was intended. That isn't something we should shy away from just because it's difficult or because it cuts against the popular narrative on diversity, because it's actually really important. If you were to listen to that narrative, the one that holds sway in the media and on Twitter, you'd be forgiven for believing that protected characteristics in the Act are things like BAME, female or LGBT. That's how it usually is put across, even by our institutions, by businesses, even by government ministers and departments on the odd occasion. And in truth, that's not correct. The characteristics listed, in fact, are race, sex, sexuality, among others. In fact, a white heterosexual male has just as much protection under this law as a black gay female. It's equal, hence the name. Sometimes it seems like nobody knows this. It's actually quite mad. Rather than existing to prevent discrimination, an awful lot of people in influential positions, even in our national institutions, seem to be under the impression that the Equalities Act and its provision around positive action gives them the right to actively discriminate in favour of certain groups. Discrimination on the basis of those characteristics is, of course, illegal, whether it has positive as a prefix or not, and yet seems commonplace. For example, there are countless scholarships and bursaries for higher levels of study offered only to BAME students. That's not positive action, I'm afraid, that's discrimination. There's a difference. Encouraging underrepresented BAME students to apply for scholarships, yes. Excluding all white students from a scholarship on the basis of their race should be a no. That's the very definition of discrimination. Even worse when, through the lens of identity politics, it's actually the disadvantaged white children that struggle most to access HE, not BME children. It's positive discrimination in favour of a group that already statistically do better and at the expense of the most underrepresented. And yet, as I've said, this is commonplace. So the Act, or at least the interpretation and implementation of it, is fundamentally flawed. According to research by the writer and commentator Douglas Murray, it has in the main tended to support and promote those who are already closest to their destination, rather than digging down into supporting those in genuine need, perhaps due to the lack of provision around socio-economic circumstances. There is a socio-economic duty within the Act, Mrs Cummins, Section 1, in fact, that will put a duty onto public bodies to exercise their duties in a way that is designed to reduce socio-economic inequalities. But this section has never been enacted. Now, I'm not a legal expert. I'm sure there's a reason for that. Perhaps some unintended consequences that would occur if it was enacted, perhaps a perception that it's unnecessary, public bodies should already be doing this. I know this isn't directly in the Minister's brief, but I wonder if, following the debate, she might ask the Equalities Minister to write to me on this issue. It seems clear that socio-economic status or social class are, in fact, the greatest indicator of life chances, and yet this isn't a protected characteristic, nor is it enacted in Section 1. I'm sure that there is a reason. I will give way.
I'm very grateful for giving way, and he's making an excellent speech and a very good case, not just on the specific points he's mentioned, but in the wider principle of making sure that the Equalities Act actually works. I just wondered, could I add to his sort of list there the issue of geographical disadvantage, that often where you are born in this country, not just the family you're born into, anything, but the geographical disadvantage is often a key factor that very often gets overlooked and doesn't really get addressed.
That intervention, and he's absolutely right. You know, your access to services, for example, could be very much limited or decided by where you are lucky enough to be born. The key point, I suppose, that I'm making throughout this speech is that those that discrimination, those differences in terms of equality of opportunity exist outside of just these protected characteristics that are enshrined in the Act, and that there are other reasons why people might not have that same opportunity that we should be addressing. So the lack of provision around socio-economic equality within the Act and the perverse consequences of the misinterpretation of protected characteristics and positive action means that it can often seem like every other group in society has a support and protection under the Act, is protected by the Act, apart from the most disadvantaged children, and white boys and men in particular. And recently, UCAS statistics showed that only 9% of white boys on free school meals go to university. The second lowest was white girls on free school meals at 14%. White boys from disadvantaged backgrounds are most likely to drop out of school with no qualifications and have the lowest rate of achieving GCSEs, followed by, yes, disadvantaged white girls. In contrast, black or Asian girls have the highest chances of going to university. And if these statistics were reversed, you could guarantee there would be an uproar. In BME groups, boys also tend to do worse than girls. Rates of grammar school entry, for example, is another place where the results differ based on that ethnic background. Disadvantaged white British children enter grammar school at the lowest rate of any major ethnic group. Disadvantaged Indian pupils are 4 times more likely to attend. Chinese pupils, 15 times more likely. And again, across all races and ethnicities, boys are lower in the rankings than girls. So in education, at least, the constant false interpretation of the Act, which promotes positive action for BAME and female, seems entirely backwards. It's disadvantaged white boys that are statistically faring the worst, that are underrepresented at universities, underrepresented in our public institutions, and whose life chances are most limited through being most likely to have no qualifications. So the popular narrative of white privilege is regularly wheeled out, assuming that these poorest white children don't face discrimination on that basis, Mrs. Cummings, but in fact, they do. If you step outside of the Twitter bubble, then you'll be faced with the stark reality that through this kind of rhetoric, our society is ignoring what is statistically one of its most vulnerable demographics. As it happens, these lads are also more likely than anyone to chuck themselves in front of a train, and that's not a coincidence. It could be argued, if one was so inclined, that the Act, or at least the unfettered misapplication of the Act, has played a part in exacerbating this problem. I've long argued that identity politics is divisive and unhelpful, and this Act enshrines it in our laws. It doesn't recognise the individual need of the most disadvantaged people and actively supports the advancement of others through so-called positive action based not on their actual individual needs or disadvantage, not on any actual discrimination or barriers they face as individuals, but on the basis of broad assumptions based on their physical characteristics. The identity politics, the lumping of people into boxes rather than considering their individual circumstances that is enshrined in the Act is deeply troubling. We've seen it manifest itself in other ways that have caught this popular public narrative recently, and yet surely it's the case that privilege or hardship are not in fact based on which of these characteristic boxes you have, but in fact down to your wider individual circumstances. Things like your socioeconomic background or the geography, as my honourable friend mentioned. And socioeconomic status, social class, is in fact more indicative of your life chances than these physical characteristics. They play a part, of course they do. Discrimination exists, racism exists, misogyny, homophobia, of course they do. But they're one part of a more complex picture, one segment of an individual's life experience and of their opportunity. We should help people based on their actual needs, not on the basis of guesswork based on flawed metrics. The interpretation and implementation of the Act is deeply flawed. I'm fed up to the back teeth of identity politics, Mrs. Cummings, to be honest. I don't want to be stood here saying white kids this and white kids that. I value all kids and all of their futures, and the support that they get should be based on what they need, not on the colour of their skin or their gender or any other grand narrative that we concoct, it seems, to make ourselves feel better. Separating black and white, gay and straight, male and female all the time, and in this way is combative, it's unhelpful. But it feels sometimes like I have to highlight white kids and white disadvantaged kids and their plight, because otherwise they don't seem to get a look in. If you talk generally about disadvantage, then the system, our legislation, this misinterpretation of the Equalities Act always seem to bring that discussion back around to BAME, female, and other misinterpretations that we've enshrined in law. If you don't say white kids, then the popular narrative and the system seem to, and have, in many cases, left them behind in favour of a fundamentally flawed diversity agenda, which is hugely frustrating, and in many ways it's wrong. So in closing, I asked the Minister some questions, and I don't know the answers, and I don't expect her to know the answers, but I hope that they will be taken away for her consideration. I know as an Education Minister, she'll no doubt have some remarks on the points I've made around educational aspects, which I would welcome, and I know the Secretary of State's been very clear on his wish to support more disadvantaged white working class boys into university, for example, if that's their aspiration, and that's very welcome. But I have some questions regarding the Equalities Act itself, and I wonder if she could take them away and perhaps raise them with colleagues in the Equalities Office. Firstly, why is the socio-economic provision within the Act not enacted? And if it is flawed or inappropriate in its detail, how can we fix it? What protections can the Act offer to those who face barriers and discrimination based on being poor, being in care, or other hardships that aren't recognised in this law? Secondly, if the answer currently is none, then will the government look closely at the implications of this section of the Act and seek to amend it in a way that would offer such support? Thirdly, could government review the implications of amending the Act to remove or change any damaging positive action elements which go way beyond preventing discrimination and actually, due to the constant misinterpretation by those who claim ownership of it, appear in practice to condone positive discrimination to the exclusion of some of our country's poorest people? And finally, at the very least, could government consider clearly restating the actual aims and nature of the provisions of this Act, laying out the reality and challenging the false rhetoric that exists around it, and requiring its own officers and institutions to implement it in a fair and balanced way? There are fundamental flaws, in my view, in the way that this Act is implemented, whether by poor design or poor interpretation, but left unchallenged, this has made things worse for some of the most vulnerable children in our society. The narrative has led to things like fee-paying schools rejecting charitable support for disadvantaged children based on their race. We've heard in recent weeks that this narrative has led to racial segregation in UK businesses like Sainsbury's. It's unhealthy. It's a backward step, in my view, Mrs Cummings, and something needs to change.